Okay, I just want to make sure you're getting what you need to out of this section of the course in order to proceed. Because the one thing you should notice is we've gone through some of the basics of ethics. We've dealt with an ethical problem, namely the trolley problem and the fat man problem, which are similar problems, ethical problems. We've learned what an ethical problem is, what philosophy is, the methods of philosophy, namely how we decide, how we make decisions in philosophy, and how we go about investigating to find the right answer. And we've gone through that fairly extensively, and we actually started talking about one particular moral problem related to the question of the ring of Gyges example. And I think you're getting a feel for it. Now we're moving on to the second part of the course where we're trying to get you to understand, well, what philosophy has to say about some of these things, or what philosophers have to say about some of these things, and furthermore, how we can go about solving some of these questions. And I'm going to go through some stuff pretty quickly because you've seen it before. I've reorganized it a little bit, and I'm going to go through it really fast, but get to the points at the end about moral theory, because moral theories and the discussion of moral theories is something that I find in the applied ethics course that students have a problem really of getting a hold of. Because the idea is, as you look at the particular moral problems that we're dealing with in this week's information, in the next week's modules and the modules after, we're talking about actually applying what we've learned to real world problems in either criminal justice ethics or business ethics. In our case, it happens to be criminal justice ethics. And just to give you an idea of the way you should be viewing this, notice we talked about moral problems and moral reasoning. We talked about that is, the way to solve the trolley problem was we were doing something about moral reasoning. We learned about moral reasoning in arguments, and specifically how to formulate those arguments and what we've learned about it. We talked about relativism versus objectivism, which is a meta-ethical question. And I thought I gave you really good reasons for thinking relativism was just not acceptable. Most people, while they seem to nod their heads, say, yeah, that's true, when they really think about it, they don't believe it. I also mentioned some agent-based moral theories and action-based moral theories, and I talked about two sets with regard to action-based moral theories: divine command theories of natural rights and consequentialism, utilitarian deontology. And I want to go back through, I just want to quickly leaf through and review what we've done, and then I want to go back to the agent-based morality, just make a couple points, and then talk about action-based moralities and spend a couple of minutes on consequentialism and deontology. Because in this section of the course, consequentialism or utilitarianism and deontology are really the kinds of theories, or the reasons that are associated with these kinds of theories are specific to the kinds of moral problems that people usually find themselves divided over in questions of criminal justice ethics, or any applied ethics for that matter. Well, we went through the trolley examples. We formulated 4 arguments about throwing the fat man off. We talked about how we should decide the issue by evaluating the arguments. And if we looked at it, there were 2 questions to ask with regard to evaluating it. Was the argument valid? And then was it sound? And the idea is, if it's valid, then if it's sound depends on whether all the premises are true. And we looked at the truth, where we were wondering, is the truth of any premise in any of the arguments questionable? And I want to talk about a distinction quickly between normative premises and factual premises. I've talked about it before. Normative premises, the first premise in all of our reconstructed arguments are normative. They're moral premises. And then there are factual premises. And the one thing we should notice is the factual premises, the second premises, we noted they're just a matter of the way the example was set up. But if we're going to question anything, so everything, we can't distinguish which are good arguments and which are bad arguments because of a problem with the factual premise, because the factual premise is just telling us information about the way the examples were set up. But rather the moral, we better find something, and I'll explain why we better find something when we're looking at the moral premises. And the moral premises being, A, if we can save 5 people by killing 1, then the right thing to do is to kill 1. And B, it's wrong to kill an innocent person even if it saves 5 others. And the idea is some of the arguments used a premise that was like A, and in fact it was exactly A, and some of the other arguments used B. And the problem that we have with that is A and B seem to contradict each other. That is, if A is true, B is false, and if B is true, A is false. So we got in kind of sticky water because if we look, we had 4 arguments. One that was right to turn, the second one that was right not to turn, the third one it was right to throw the fat man off the bridge, the second one is right not to throw the fat man off the bridge. And the problem we had is most people picked, or at least certainly the majority of people picked, it was right to turn the trolley, but when it came to the fat man problem, it was right not to throw the fat man off the bridge. And so their claim had to be that the first and the fourth argument were sound, but the problem with that is the first and the fourth argument, one uses moral principle A, the other one uses moral principle B, and they can't both be true. So we seem at least to have a contradiction. Then there are a couple of other positions you could take to try to resolve the problem. That is, stick with moral premise A, and then 1 and 3 are the right arguments. So you say, whoa, it's right to turn, so it's also right to throw the fat man off the bridge. Well, that has some people thinking twice because they just don't think that you can throw the fat man off the bridge. So then maybe we have to take position B, which is it's right not to turn and it's right not to throw the fat man off the bridge. Okay, although a lot of people have really strong inclinations, and maybe not in this example, to think that, we really ought to turn in this case if we know nothing about the individuals. And I think these are really there's one other position you could take, and I don't think anybody takes that position, is that it's you don't have 2 and 3 anyway. That's right, 2 and 3. That is, it's right not to turn, but it's right to throw the fat man off the bridge. And those don't seem to go together because those are the things that were counterintuitive about the majority opinion to begin with. So no one's opinion is really 2 or 3. Okay, none of the positions seems acceptable. Now, is there some way we can save these 2 moral premises? That is, if we can save 5 people by killing 1, then the right thing to do is to kill 1, and it's wrong to kill an innocent person even if it saves 5 others. Now, the problem about saving these premises is, they seem to contradict each other. Now, when we look at it, moral premises are certain kinds of moral principles, and in fact, sometimes they're based on general moral principles, which is why we started looking at the moral theories, because the moral theories were derived or were created by philosophers to explain what morality was all about. It was supposed to give general conditions why either one of these would be true, the other one, or why there's a more general principle that could explain the two and better apply them. So that we might be also looking at a more general principle on which A and B are based. Both are based, and it'll give us a refinement of A and B so they won't be contradictory. But the first one really goes into the moral theories, and the first one we looked at was kind of the meta-ethical divide, we might say. That is, it was moral relativism and moral objectivism. Moral relativism, things based on, or the decision being based on being relative to a person. That is, I feel, I think it's right, so it's right for me, or it's right for a society or culture. Objectivism mentioned a couple, and we're going to go down through the moral theories. Again, you've been through it once, and you know my reservations. That is, I really don't think anybody really buys moral relativism, even though everybody says, yeah, it's true because they think it's good and they don't want to tell people that they don't have a right to their opinion. But we talked about cultural relativism and the problems with cultural relativism. So I think that, and cultural relativism, I should mention, is probably thought to be the best of the relativist theories, but we'll talk about a couple of them, a couple others. Okay, and the others being ethical egoism, and action is right if and only if it's in my best interest. But, you know, according to this theory, it may be right for a sadist to torture little children. That seems really problematic. That is, the right thing to do is to torture little innocent children or rape little children for a pedophile. Maybe that's in his best interest. That's problematic. The view contractarianism is, that is, it has to do with the social contract, and well, I think that captures some moral ideas that we have. It would seem that in Nazi Germany, they had a different social contract than we had in the United States, and apartheid South Africa also had different social contracts, and things were right because of their social contracts, which was kind of problematic, or bothers a lot of people. Now, I did mention, and really is the end, agent-based theories. And the idea about an agent-based theory is an agent-based moral theory or agent-based ethics is based on being a good or a virtuous agent, a role. It's kind of a role model, you know, that is, there used to be a commercial about Michael Jordan, you know, like be like Mike. And it's a basketball player. That would be a great virtue. But the question, you know, if you know, and there were a couple of ways of filling this out. One is standard virtue ethics. You know, it stretches a good agent and its character rather than defining right or wrong actions. And there a variation on that is feminist ethics, stressing feminine virtues, the ethics of cares. But the problem is, first of all, how do you apply these things in our examples, and how does it help us determine a right answer? It's hard to see. We got to find what the virtuous guy is going to do, but the virtuous guy doesn't necessarily do everything right or wrong. You know, he just has a good character. So it's hard really to see, and I don't really think that these kinds of theories are going to explain or going to help us solve the problems that we're talking about. But you should know that they're ethical theories that are have been proposed, and one of virtue ethics, an original proposer of that was well, the ancient Greeks. Certainly Plato seemed to have a version of it. Aristotle for sure is associated. Then we talked about action-based moral objectivist theories. The divine command theory, action's right if and only if God commands it. And the problem is, well, first of all, is there a God? You know, so you have to, and you know, if somebody's an atheist, it looks like there's nothing to talk about with the person. And then the question is, well, even if you assume that that God does exist, does he command me to turn the trolley or not to turn the trolley? It's throw the fat man off the bridge. Where do you find these commandments? How do you know what they are? Maybe there is something to this theory, but it's certainly not going to help us resolve our applied problem. Maybe it'll tell us something about where we might find an answer, but the question is, what's in the holy books? You know, why think that they're really divine? You know, they're the divine law if you don't think that God exists. We talked briefly about natural rights theory, and action's right if and only if it doesn't violate anyone's natural rights. And this seems something, especially this seems to be an intuitively good theory. That is, that you have these natural rights. It kind of raises the question, though, of where do these rights come from? I mean, we know Thomas Jefferson, in taking Locke's position, setting up the foundation of our country, said we have, in the Declaration of Independence, that we have certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke was life, liberty, and property. But the question is, where do the rights come from? And then how do we figure out what these are? And there might be good answers to this, but I think this may just be, and a better way of viewing this kind of theory is just by looking at it as another version of deontology. So I don't want to kind of set these aside as not being helpful, and was really looking at utilitarianism or consequentialism. Is an action is right if and only if it has the best consequences, I should say consequences, for everyone. Attributed Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and a contemporary philosopher, Peter Singer. I think he's still alive. And the interesting thing about these versions of consequentialism, it's the consequences of an action that make it right or wrong, and they're associated with the measurement of pain and pleasure, and that's where the name utilitarianism comes. So deontology. So utilitarian or consequentialism comes. Now, an alternative. There are, people don't find this plausible when they start looking at a lot of examples. They don't think that it's giving us the right examples, and it leads people to think maybe a deontological theory. Deon meaning duty. That is it. Excuse me. As a person, you have certain duties, you have certain obligations, and that's where it kind of relates to the natural rights. That is, if you have a certain right, that is a right to life, everybody else has a duty, a certain obligation not to violate that right that you have. And presumably these can be set up as a set of rules explaining what makes an action right or wrong. And in general, one of the most famous versions of deontology was proposed by a very famous philosopher named Immanuel Kant. And it says an action is right if and only if it conforms to the duties of the person acting. Now the question is, how do you figure out what your duties are? And Immanuel Kant's answer to that question was, your duties are such that it would be okay for you to do it if it would be okay in general terms, or it would be consistent that you would want everybody to act on the very same motives that are the motives that you have for acting in this way, that you have good motives, and they don't violate anybody's rights because everybody has these same sets of duties and presumably corresponding rights. Now, there are problems with both of these theories, and if you're really interested in delving into detail into these two theories, Philosophy 74's Introduction to Ethics is what we spend the second half of the semester doing, looking at these theories in some detail, the good, the bad, and the ugly of the theories. And let me just leave you, for the sake of this course, saying there are problems with both of these theories. Now the question is, you're saying, okay, so what's the right answer? And it seems to me that a lot of our thinking about morality, and when we talk about it, the kind of moral principles that we use are utilitarian or consequentialist principles, and sometimes they're deontological principles, and perhaps there's a way of that is both have a certain amount of truth to them, and the question is, how do we apply them, where do we apply them, and which principles work, and which versions of the principles work for the particular example that we're talking about. That is, and I think one way where I see this very often is sometimes it's not clear. You don't have a duty to do something or a duty not to do something, but because of the consequences of one is a better action than the other. So you have different kinds of reasons explaining your actions. Now, here is the point that I wanted to get to. When we move into the problems that we're about to discuss, having to do with applying ethics to certain cases. We're going to talk about Serpico, and we're going to go back to talking about how a policeman should be acting in certain circumstances, and we're going to talk about what motivated him and whether we think that either utilitarian or deontological kind of principles or kind of reasons will explain why he did or did not do the right thing, and we're going to compare and contrast him with Michael Dowd and Ken Urell, his partner. And we're also going to be looking at other problems involved in in criminal justice. And when we think about them, and when you're taking a position and explaining to me what the right thing is and what the wrong thing is, you want to think about giving an argument and giving reasons why something is right or wrong, not just telling me it's the ethical thing or it's not the ethical thing, but rather you want to tell me why it's the ethical thing. And in doing that, I think you should really be thinking about, well, is my reasoning here using utilitarian kind of principles? Is it using deontological ones, or both of them, to at least be clear about what you're doing? Because I think if you proceed in that way, you are going to be able to have a more rational discussion with other people with whom you disagree about these moral issues, and perhaps if you can't come to an agreement, at least you'll come to a detailed understanding of where you disagree, and sometimes in the process you end up changing your mind and change the position you have. But just remember, when you focus on utilitarian or consequentialist kinds of reasons and deontological kinds of reasons, and think about the reasons that you're giving why certain actions were right or why they were wrong in certain cases, and use that, make clear, because otherwise anything you're writing you could have written before you came to this course. So the point in what you're writing from now on is to try to show the reader, in other words me, that you understand these kinds of issues, and you understand what a utilitarian reason it would be and what a deontological reason is. Or maybe you think one of these theories is absolutely true to the exclusion of the other one, and you're going to have to explain to me, you're going to have to defend that claim.